Hi, thank you for watching Yoga with Elia. This is Elia, and today I would like to cover a certain posture. I'd like to do a little posture breakdown of Warrior 1, Virabhadrasana 1, and specifically the back leg. So I'm not going to go into every other facet of the posture because there's a lot to cover and it could take a while. I wanted to specifically review the back leg because the way that it is actually commonly taught isn't as functionally appropriate and balanced as it could be. And so if we just look at what the actual common way of teaching Warrior 1 is, as far as the back leg goes, is you're supposed to basically be in a lunge, but your back foot and your back leg are supposed to be in a partially externally rotated position. So you don't have your foot totally straight and neutral because that would require a lot of ankle flexibility and dorsiflexion, but neither is it supposed to go straight to the left at a 90-degree angle or straight to the side as in Warrior 2. It's a little bit in between. Now, the thing about this is that we have to understand when you position your back foot in any orientation, that implies that your hip has to follow suit. And you can just kind of remember this as a rule of thumb that wherever your toes point, it's important to also point your knee in the same direction. Because if you have a disparity between where your foot is oriented and then where your thigh is oriented, that difference is going to cause twisting in the knee. And as we know, the knee is just meant to flex and extend. It just bends one way like a hinge joint. It's not supposed to be a twisting joint. And so twisting it can actually harm all of the internal structures that make the knee balanced and effective. So when you have your knee positioned, when you have your foot, positioned in this direction, what the common instruction is to still square the pelvis forward. But what we have to understand is what muscles control this position of the leg. And there's actually two movements that the back leg is doing. So one movement, as you could tell, is you're going from neutral, which is here, back. So that's called hip extension. And then you add, as I already mentioned, an external rotation component. Now, this movement in itself is really generated by a single muscle, which is your butt, the glute max. The glute max is primarily a hip extensor. Secondarily, it's an external rotator. Now, when we just walk in normal gait, the back foot, the trailing foot, really does have to go through a little subtle amount of external rotation every time we do the push-off or the toe-off phase when we're propelling ourselves forward. But then there's a limit to this. And the limit is really constituted by the fact that the bones of your hip, the actual structure of your hip joint, has limitations in how far it can actually go back into extension while externally rotating. So for this, I wanted to pull out my hip joint model. And so I'm actually going to take it off its little support. So this is one half of your pelvis, your ilium, and your pelvis actually contains the hip joint. So this is your femur, your thigh bone, as it plugs into the acetabulum, and the connection, the relationship between the head of your femur, which is the ball, and the socket, the acetabulum, that comprises the hip joint. Now, this would be the right side of the hip and the pelvis. So if I just turn this model to the side, so you can see what happens when you go into that extension and external rotation. So we are asked in Warrior 1 to go into extension, which is away from the midline, away from neutral, and then externally rotate. Now, there is a limit to when this becomes too much. So in normal walking gait, you really go through about this much extension, flexion, extension. As you can tell when you walk, you're not taking big strides every time you step. Your back leg doesn't have to go that far back into extension. So the problem arises is when we get into a warrior posture, we are asked to take our leg far back because we have to be able to get the front knee, or at least we're told to get the front knee into as close as possible a 90-degree angle. Now, this requires a lot of hip extension. If you look at medical literature, and especially something that physical therapists have studied and have established, is your hip joint shouldn't go, technically, structurally, cannot go past 15 degrees of extension. Now, 15 degrees, just so you can see what it looks like in the body, is, if 45 degrees is about here, 15 degrees is about here. And you can tell it really isn't that much. It is definitely far less than what we're commonly asked to get into when we do something like Warrior One. Now, here's where the problem arises when you take your hip past that 15-degree limitation or edge. So as you take, maybe this will be a little bit of a better shot, as you take your hip into extension, so this movement here, so that it's clear for everybody, is basically when you just take your leg straight back without externally rotating the leg or the toes. You just take your leg straight back while having the toes face ahead. So this is just extension. And then we're asked to go into external rotation. Now, this is exactly the picture that I want to try to sear into your minds, because what you have here is the surfaces of the joint. As you can tell, the head of the femur and the socket of the hip is they lose contact. Now, when your joints have contact, that's just generally referred to as joint congruence. That's when things actually work well. That's when joint function is optimal. When there's maximal joint congruence, meaning when there's maximum contact between two joint surfaces. But as you just saw, if I take my leg back past that 15 degrees of extension and I add external rotation to it, you see how the blue of the head of the femur disconnects from the blue of the acetabulum? That is not joint congruence. So here, your hip joint is unstable. And there's two things that are sacrificed by this. One is there's a ligament that comes right out of the center of the head of the femur called the ligamentum teres. That's just basically the central ligament of the femur that supplies, that has a lot of vascular supply to the actual femur itself. And so what we compromise is we begin to stretch out that ligamentum teres to a point where if we do this long enough and persistently enough, we can actually start to wear away at this ligament and compromise the vascular supply that it's supposed to supply into the damn femur, okay? So that's one thing that gets lost. Now, if I turn this around, so maybe you could see a little bit clearly, so again, we have extension and external rotation. The other thing that occurs if you take your hip back into extension that far with external rotation, because it's both of them that cause this issue, you start to push the neck of the femur. So the neck of the femur is the place between the vertical part of the femur and the head, the neck, basically. You start to push that, if you can see this, right against the posterior edge, this edge right here, of your acetabulum. And that becomes a problem, because if you do this over and over again, the outer rim of your acetabulum has cartilage, and even more so, it has your hip labrum. So doing this over and over again will start to break down the cartilage and the labrum, which is basically a way that your hip is cushioned and that you have better articulation, more solidity of your hip joint. You start to break those structures down, and that effectively, both of these things, even one of these things, can lead to a breakdown of your hip joint, therefore precipitating hip arthritis, and even worse yet, having to get a hip replacement. But now we're compounding the issue by creating both of these conditions. And we create both of these conditions when we're asked to go beyond the natural capabilities of your hip extension in a posture like Warrior One. And this is a problem. This is a problem because we don't want to actually have our yoga practice undermine the health integrity of our body. We want it to support it. And of course, yoga and the practice of yoga isn't just all about health and wellness, but at the very least, we have to be able to know that our yoga practice shouldn't hurt us in the long run. It should only help to sustain and support how our body functions. So here's what I want to offer to you. I want to offer to you a alternative, a supplement to Warrior One. But before I do that, think about it this way. If you still want to insist on doing Warrior One, of course, you're more than welcome to, then make sure that you keep yourself safe by maybe taking a stance this short. Because remember, at the end of the day, Warrior One isn't a posture that is practiced for flexibility purposes. Or Warrior Two or Warrior Three, we don't do these postures in order to attain more flexibility and more stretching of the legs and hips. Warrior postures, as their name implies, are really about establishing strength and fortitude in the legs. And this is why standing poses are basically my favorite class of postures, because as you start to develop the health, integrity, and intelligence of how to use your legs and hips, that is the essential foundation of your spine. So if you want to have good spinal health, which I hope you do, because your spine is really the nexus of your health as a whole, you want to be able to take care of your legs first, because if you have a flimsy foundation, there's no way that the spine can realistically function optimally, the way that it was designed to function. So if you want to do Warrior One, then do it with a short stance to where you're not exaggerating the depth of extension beyond 15 degrees. So, 15 degrees would be about this short a stance. But if you want to actually practice creating a little bit more flexibility with your lunging position, while at the same time strengthening everything that you would strengthen in Warrior One anyways, what I want to offer is swap this out for just a basic high lunge. So what you have in a basic high lunge is everything the same. The only difference is your back foot, your back heel is lifted, and because your heel is lifted, you'll be able to actually neutralize the rotation of your hip. So that means you can come out of external rotation, and by bringing your leg back into neutral rotation, you're no longer conflicting the knee joint, because when you're in this position, in typical standard classical Warrior One, when your foot is externally rotated, but we're instructed to continue squaring the hips forward, we're really pulling the pelvis forward, and therefore we're pulling the thigh forward. But because we're demanding, and the teachers are demanding that the back foot stay stuck and doesn't move, all that forward squaring action comes just from the knee and above, because everything below it has been locked down. So this really puts the knee at risk if you try to square your pelvis and your back thigh forward. Whereas if you go into high lunge and you lift your back heel, all of a sudden you have a lot more freedom to actually neutralize the rotation of your back leg and hip. And then you can actually engage your glutes a little bit more securely, a little bit more confidently, and just start to build up the strength of your hip extension, right? And as far as the arms go, I'll cover that in another video. But as far as as far as high lunge is concerned, we're still stuck with the same thing, right? We're still stuck with the fact that medical literature and research has shown that even here, you can't really take your hip back past that 15-degree limitation. So here's what happens. When you get into high lunge, and clearly my back leg here is way past 15 degrees in extension, I've already hit the limit of hip extension. And so the next thing that would naturally happen is my pelvis would be caused to tip forward. So I'll show you this in the model again. So again, this is the front. And so if I'm taking the hip joint just straight back, if I'm just taking straight into extension, Eventually, I'll also hit the limit of this movement, and this limitation, if I'm forcing my leg to go back further than 15 degrees, will cause, just like this, because the whole unit is going to move, the pelvis, that is going to cause it to tip forward. So when your pelvis tips forward or anteriorly tilts, it'll exaggerate the curve of your lower back. So in a high lunge, as I said already, having my hip go this far back into extension, I've already hit the limit of extension. So if I'm forcing it to go back further than 15 degrees, then that's going to start to create an anterior tilt in the pelvis. So it's like if you're in a high lunge and you're attempting to stick your butt out. And there isn't really much you can do to fight against that. So what I'm proposing is you still have a deep lunge and you still engage your back leg and you still bring it back into good deep extension, but then you try to counter all of that anterior tilting of the pelvis and all the exaggeration of lumbar extension by simply working on lifting your lower belly up and engaging the deep, deep core muscles of the transversus abdominis. And so as you practice high lunge, it is really effectively a back bend technique where the abdominals and especially the transversus abdominals are very necessary. So when you do this, continue working on two main things. Three if you want to work a little bit harder. One is the action of your left glute or the glute of your back leg into providing good, safe hip extension. Two, the lifting of your lower belly at the same time so you don't have an exaggerated lower back curve. And three is, of course, the ability to keep your back leg straight. And the last point that I want to leave off on high lunge is how to make sure that your back leg is rotating forward adequately. Okay? Now, the way that you do this is by connecting to the feeling and the action of your back foot. Now, if you look at the back foot in this position, I still have a little bit of external rotation, and I'm tending to lean more weight towards the big toe mount, and that creates external rotation. Now, if I swivel the back leg forward more to neutral in the direction of internal rotation, the weight bearing from my big toe will then start to shift more to the little toe edge. So when you do high lunge, start from the ground and notice how the ball of your foot is situated. And what you think about is pulling the outer edge of your back foot upwards. So instead of placing, like we're asked to in Warrior One, pressing the outer edge of your back foot to the floor and lifting the inner arch, in high lunge, it's actually the contrary. You lift your back foot and you attempt to pull right here, the outer blade of your foot in an actual called eversion. You attempt to pull it up towards the rest of the leg and towards the rest of the body. And this will initiate all of the internal rotation properties that you need to make this much extension safer. So I guess that's actually four things if you think about it. So starting from the back foot, you want to make sure that you're lifting the outer blade of your foot towards the rest of the body. And in that sense, you're kind of lengthening the inner edge of the foot and reaching it back behind you. And that's going to help you rotate your thigh and your knee forward, make your hip neutral. Number two is you engage your glute a lot. Three, you keep your quads engaged so that your knee doesn't bend. And four is, of course, you lift your lower belly to support and protect your lower back. So try that out. As far as any traditional practices and styles, methods, where Warrior One is kind of a central posture, the only thing I could say is this. Not everything passed down from tradition, whether it's yoga or anything else, is always going to be useful. And the gift of modern science, the gift of human ingenuity and human inquiry, is that we can start to challenge some of these traditional principles and allow science to inform perhaps that it could be done a little bit better. Because remember, what we're after in the long run is to have better health and function of the human body. What use is it to just appease some traditional principles if it breaks down our well-being? The tradition in itself exists in order to support well-being, not to diminish it. I hope this was useful for you today. Please practice safely, be aware of your body, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching. Namaste.